The wind slid across the prairie like a breath against old bones, carrying the thin cry of newborns into the soft morning light. A pale sun crept over the horizon, warming nothing, merely revealing what had been done in the dark. Alma Reeves lay against a splintered fence post, wrists bound with rough rope, her pink prairie dress torn and streaked with dust. Her cheek was bruised the color of a fading violet, her lips split where someone's hand had silenced her hours ago. Beside her, two swaddled twin girls whimpered softly in the chill, their cries swallowed by the endless openness of the land. The wind didn't lie. It carried the scent of trampled dirt and broken trust. It carried the sound of a young woman left where no one should be left. Behind the nearest rise, hoofbeats approached, slow, measured, as though the rider had seen this kind of ruin before and had learned to move carefully through it. James Holloway guided his horse down the slope, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. Dust lifted around him like ghost breath, soft and steady. Alma turned her head weakly toward the sound, her eyes wide and fever-bright, unsure if mercy or another blow was coming. She tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. The newborn's cries fluttered like moths against the still air. James reined in the horse a few feet from her and dismounted without a word. He'd seen cruelty on the plains, drunk men with mean tempers, hungry families turning on each other, but there was something different about this kind of abandonment. This was the kind of cruelty that wore a familiar face. He crouched beside her, his shadow falling over her body like a small shelter. Her wrists were red and raw. The twins blinked up at him through tiny lashes, faces pink with cold. "Don't," she whispered, as if kindness were too much to bear. He didn't answer. He took out his knife, its blade catching a sliver of sunlight, and sliced through the rope with quiet precision. The sound was soft but final. Her arms fell limp at her sides, too weak to rise. He reached for the twins first, wrapping his weathered coat around them, the fabric swallowing their fragile shape. Then, with careful hands, he slid one arm behind her shoulders, steadying her as she trembled. The wind shifted. A crow lifted from the fence post and cut through the silence with its rough cry. Alma flinched. She smelled like fear and earth and something else, something stubborn that hadn't yet broken, though the world had tried. James looked toward the town, the faint shapes of rooftops just visible through the haze. He knew what had happened before she even spoke. Willow Creek was small, and people talked too loudly when they felt righteous. A widow giving birth to 2 daughters instead of a son, that was enough for some to turn their hearts to stone. She tried to speak again, her breath shallow. "They left us." Her voice cracked on the last word, as if the leaving itself had split something inside her that could not be mended. He slid his arm beneath her knees, lifted her as though she weighed nothing, and carried her toward the horse. She didn't fight him. She only clutched the twins tighter, burying her face against them. He mounted carefully with her in his arms, positioning the babies between them where his coat kept out the wind. The ride toward his cabin was quiet except for the rhythmic clop of hooves and the twins' occasional cries. The land stretched wide and pale around them, open fields and thin trees, no witnesses but the wind. She stared at nothing, her breath hitching in shallow bursts, as though the silence itself might break her. He didn't ask her name. He didn't tell her his. Sometimes names only make pain heavier. When the cabin came into view, nestled against a line of pines, the air softened. A dog barked once and fell quiet. Smoke rose faintly from an unlit chimney, catching the morning light. He swung down, then lowered her gently, supporting her weight until she could stand on trembling legs. Inside, the air smelled faintly of leather and pine smoke. He set a chair close to the hearth, then knelt to light the fire, the sparks catching like small stars. The twins began to wail again, hungry cries that pierced the stillness. He handed her a clean wool blanket from a chest, stepping back to give her space. She clutched it to her chest as if it might hold back everything she'd lost. For a long time they said nothing. Only the crackle of kindling filled the room. Her eyes followed him as he moved, boots quiet on the floorboards, hands steady as he fetched water from a jug, placed a pot near the fire. She did not trust him, but she also did not fear him. His silence was different from theirs. Theirs had been sharp and cruel. His was steady like river stones. She tried to rise, then faltered. He was beside her before she could fall, one hand lightly beneath her elbow. She stiffened at the touch. He stepped back immediately, as if understanding her without needing her to explain. Her gaze drifted toward the door, toward the road that led back to the place where she'd been tied to that fence. Her voice shook. "They said I brought shame." His jaw tightened, a muscle shifting beneath the stubble along his cheek. He didn't offer pretty words. He simply turned back to the fire and fed it another stick of wood. Outside, the wind brushed against the cabin walls like a restless hand. Hours passed in slow silence. He brought her a bowl of warm broth, placing it within reach but not forcing it. Her hands shook as she lifted it. One of the twins stirred against her chest, tiny fists waving weakly at the air. She pressed her lips to the baby's head and closed her eyes, tears slipping down the sides of her face without sound. James stepped out onto the porch as the sky deepened toward evening, the sun slipping low and gold over the prairie. He leaned against the railing, watching the shadows lengthen. Inside, her quiet sobbing faded into soft breaths, the kind that sound like someone who hasn't slept in too long. He didn't know her story in its fullness, but he knew enough. A woman cast out, 2 daughters left to freeze, and a town that loved its judgment more than its mercy. He'd lived long enough to know some things don't need telling to be understood. Behind him, the cabin door creaked softly. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in the wool blanket, her hair loose and falling around her face like a curtain. Her eyes were red, but there was something in them now, a thin thread of steadiness, small but unbroken. She didn't speak, and neither did he. The wind carried the faint whistle of distant fields. She stepped out slowly, the babies bundled against her. He didn't move to help her this time. She stood beside him, shoulders almost touching, and together they looked at the fading sky. There were no promises in the air, no declarations, no quick comfort to erase what had been done. But there was quiet. And in quiet, sometimes, hope begins its slow work. The gossip reached the saloon before the sun had fully climbed the sky. A ranch hand whispered it over a cup of coffee, and within the hour, the whole of Willow Creek carried it like wind-borne ash. James Holloway had taken in Alma Reeves, the widow with twin daughters, not sons, and already the whispers grew teeth. They were the kind of whispers that made men frown and women purse their lips as if holding back poison. The town was small. Judgment moved faster than the river after a storm. James rode into town late that morning, hat pulled low, shoulders steady as stone. His horse's hooves struck the dirt road with a slow rhythm that echoed against shuttered windows. Men outside the saloon watched him with narrowed eyes. No one spoke to him directly. They never did, but the air around him carried their thoughts plainly enough. A woman with 2 girls had no worth, they said. A man who took her in had either lost his mind or was hiding something. He walked into the general store with his usual quiet, but the air inside shifted, taut as a stretched rope. Behind the counter, Martha Reeves stood with a basket of flour in her hands. Her mouth pinched at the sight of him, and in that moment, the blood between her and her daughter meant nothing. Her voice was cold as water left in the shade. "She's not your burden," she said without greeting him. "She belongs with her kin." James didn't look at her. He reached for the sack of oats he needed and set it on the counter with deliberate calm. Her words hung between them, sour and heavy. He counted his coins slowly, the click of metal loud in the silence. "She shamed this family," Martha went on, her voice rising slightly, "and the whole town's talking. You think they'll ever let you forget what you've done?" James finally looked up. His eyes were steady, not cruel but unreadable, like a well that kept its depths to itself. "They've talked before," he said quietly, and slid the coins toward her. That was all. He walked out, leaving her voice to catch on the air like a torn flag. By the time he returned to the cabin, the wind had stiffened. Alma was outside, sitting on the step with the twins wrapped against her chest. She had braided her hair back, and though the bruises still marked her face, something in her posture was different, straighter, more rooted. She turned at the sound of his boots but did not smile. She had learned that safety could be borrowed but not trusted too quickly. "They're talking," she said softly, not as a question. He nodded. "They'll come for me," she whispered, and her fingers clenched tighter around the babies. "They'll hurt you for it." For a long moment, he said nothing. The wind moved between them like a quiet third presence. Then he said, simply, "Let them try." Something in her broke at that, not in pain but in disbelief. She had known men who left, men who silenced, men who watched cruelty and did nothing. She had not known a man who stayed. Her throat ached with words she didn't know how to speak. He didn't look at her as he walked to the small corral to check the fence. His hands moved with the same calm he'd shown in town, as if the weight of other people's judgment couldn't shift the way he stood on his own ground. That night the prairie held its breath. The sky above the cabin burned with stars, cold and sharp. Alma paced by the hearth, the twins asleep in the cradle James had built from old pine boards. The thought of leaving pressed against her chest like a stone. She could pack what little she had, slip out while he slept, and let him keep his life untouched by her shame. She walked to the door, opened it a crack, and felt the night air brush her face. Behind her, his voice came quietly. "If you walk out that door, they win twice." She froze. He was leaning against the frame near the fire, his hat off, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Once for throwing you away," he said, "and once for making you believe you're not worth staying for." Her hand trembled on the latch. For the first time since she'd been tied to that fence, tears filled her eyes without the burn of fear behind them. She closed the door. Dawn broke pale and slow the next morning. A dust cloud appeared on the road, and the Reeves family came with it. Elias rode at the front, Martha close behind, and a few townsmen followed, men who preferred the weight of someone else's misfortune to the quiet work of their own lives. Their voices carried before their boots did, bitter and loud. James stood on the porch, hands loose at his sides, rifle slung but untouched. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The stillness around him was heavier than their shouting. "She's ours," Elias barked. "She has no place here." "She has her daughters," James answered evenly. "That's enough place." Martha stepped forward, finger stabbing the air. "You'll ruin yourself for a woman who's already ruined." He stepped off the porch. The sound of his boots on the packed earth silenced them more effectively than a threat. He stopped a few feet away, eyes steady, shoulders squared. "Then ruins got better company than most men in this town." No one moved. The wind stirred the edges of Martha's shawl. Elias's grip on his reins tightened. These were people who thrived on shame, not on fights they might lose. The weight of his stillness unsettled them more than a raised gun would have. Alma watched from the doorway, heart pounding against her ribs. He hadn't looked back at her once, but the way he stood there, alone, quiet, unwavering, made something warm and painful rise in her chest. For the first time, she didn't feel like something to be hidden. She felt seen. Elias spat on the ground, muttered something about fools, and turned his horse. One by one, the others followed, leaving their words behind like smoke after a dying fire. When the last hoofbeat faded, the prairie exhaled. James stood there a moment longer, not triumphant, not proud, just steady. Alma stepped out of the cabin, the twins held close, the morning light painting her face gold. She walked toward him, slow and unsure, as if crossing a bridge that hadn't existed the day before. She stopped beside him, close enough to hear the sound of his breath. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer hollow. It held shape now, solid, warm, alive. In the weeks that followed, the town's whispers softened, like storms that lose interest once the ground refuses to bend. Alma began tending to the horses, learning the rhythm of their quiet lives. She spoke little, but her hands grew steadier, her steps surer. The twins thrived in the soft spring light, their cries now mingled with laughter. One afternoon, beneath the budding cottonwood tree outside the cabin, Alma placed the cradle beside James's chair. No words. Just the sound of birds and wind. He looked at her, not the way men look at fragile things, but the way they look at something they've decided to protect without needing permission. The sun dipped low, warm light stretching across the land like a soft hand. She stood beside him, their shadows touching on the ground. There were no declarations, just the quiet certainty of two people who had survived other people's cruelty and chosen, slowly, to belong to something kinder. Sometimes love does not arrive with thunder. Sometimes it begins when a man stands still and refuses to let the world take away what is already his to defend. Sometimes it is a woman choosing, after everything, to stay.